Am I square or circular? Or maybe I'm oblong. Perhaps I'm obtuse? Welcome back to the channel, Boat Dragons. I'm really glad you're here with me. I want to share with you about some of the stories that have shaped me as an individual. And so this is going to be a little bit more casual video, but I think you'll enjoy it. Before we get to this topic, please make sure that you like the video if you enjoy it. If you're not subscribed to my channel and you watch my content regularly, maybe consider subscribing as well. And hit me up on my Discord so that you can join in the discussion there about books and movies and all different types of stories that we all consume, okay? This topic I felt was valuable because the stories that we consume throughout our lives have an impact on us, whether directly or indirectly. They kind of shape who we become, whether we realize it or not. And so I wanted to give you a glimpse into the kinds of stories that I grew up with and that I've interacted with throughout my life. And some of these are books, but not all of them. Some of them are movies as well. So the first one I want to talk about is Dr. Seuss. I read a lot of Dr. Seuss as a kid. My parents read Dr. Seuss to me. And if you know anything about Dr. Seuss is weird. It's fantastical, it's cheeky, it's just off the wall weird sometimes. Some of my favorite books growing up as a kid were The Lorax and Fox and Socks and One Fish, Two Fish. I loved all the Dr. Seuss books. Not only did that give me a love of stories and give me a love of stories that incorporated humor and laughter, it gave me a love for weird stuff. Weird is something I gravitate toward. I think Dr. Seuss, as it does for many children, shapes kind of that trajectory of the kind of content that we look for, the kinds of things that are entertaining to us. I know it definitely did for me. Another series that was a big part of my childhood was the Hardy Boys mysteries. From an early age, I loved reading the Hardy Boys mysteries. I love a good mystery. To this day, I still love a good mystery. It's just a really big part of my life. And those books shaped who I am in that regard. And so those are some of the books that influenced me early on from an early age. But believe it or not, my parents didn't really strongly encourage reading. I kind of did my own thing. I kind of pursued things that I wanted to pursue, read things that I was interested in, but it wasn't something that was heavily promoted in my household. Whereas movies and television was a bigger part of my household. And so some of the earliest stories that I can remember movie-wise was kind of what I call the holy trinity of fantasy movies, and that would be movies like The Never-Ending Story, Legend with Tom Cruise and Tim Curry, and Labyrinth with David Bowie. Those are some of the earliest movies that I grew up watching, and I watched them over and over, and I loved them. To this day, I still love those stories, and those are deeply fantastical movies, right? You've got unicorns and long-horned demons in Legend, the Goblin King in Labyrinth, and David Bowie is just super mysterious and menacing in that movie. If you've seen it, you know what I'm talking about. And then I absolutely loved The Never-Ending Story with Falcor, the furry white dragon, and just everything about those movies was just captivating to me. I did not realize until much later in life that The Never-Ending Story was actually based on a book by the same name, and to this day I have not read the book. I may read it at some point, but it's not high on my list. And I think that's because the movie has a lot of nostalgia for me. But all three of those movies really set my imagination soaring. I would make up stuff based on those movies. Like, I would make up new thoughts in my head as I played with my toys, and I would make my toys into those characters from those movies. And in case you're wondering, yes, I'm an only child. I'm only child alert. You know, I either played by myself with my toys or watched shows and movies with my parents, and even my parents didn't really get into a lot of the fantasy movies, right? Until a movie came along by the name of Star Wars. I absolutely loved Star Wars. One of the biggest formative movies in my journey of story was Star Wars. Now, granted, I was born in 1975, so I was only 2 years old when the first Star Wars movie came out. So I ended up seeing the first Star Wars movie much later on. Like, you know, I think I was like maybe 6 or 7 when I actually saw the first Star Wars movie for the first time. And then I saw Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi both in the theater. So I got to experience those in the theater for the first time. But I was a huge Star Wars fan. And that's one that I can remember, well, at least my dad being willing to watch with me, and he enjoyed it. I think my mom might have watched it too, but I don't remember. But we had it recorded off television on an old Betamax. If you remember Betamax machines, we had recorded the first movie off of television onto a Betamax tape, and so that was how I watched it, and pretty much watched it until the tape broke. And then by that time VHS was out, and you know, you could buy the other movies on VHS. And just this whole journey of experiencing an amazing science fantasy universe from a brilliant mind such as that of George Lucas. It was just phenomenal. That series, above all others, just captivated me. I can't tell you how many times I've watched the original Star Wars trilogy, and I've been a fan all along. Everything that they've done that was Star Wars, I've enjoyed. There's still a few of the newer series that I have to catch up on, that I haven't seen, but most everything Star Wars I have seen. Even though the prequel trilogy wasn't perfect, I still enjoyed it. Even though the sequel trilogy was definitely not perfect, I still enjoyed it because it's Star Wars, guys. I mean, to this day, I am a huge Star Wars fan, and it is such an important part of my journey on this earth. And as someone who really enjoys being taken out of reality and into a fantasy movie, Star Wars did so much for me as a consumer. Now, I did read a few comic books as well. There were a few comic books that I read, like the X-Men comics. I was always more of a Marvel guy than a DC guy, but I did read some DC comics as well. I remember early on reading the Death of Superman comics. Most of my comics consumption was Marvel, and to narrow it down further, it was the X-Men. That's mostly what I read. When I think of Marvel, me personally, it's the X-Men I think of, even though there's lots of other great characters, and I love what they've been doing with the Marvel Cinematic Universe, but I'm just sitting here waiting for them to do my X-Men boys again. I'm just like, okay, I need me some Wolverine. I need me some Gambit. I mean, guys, I'm a Gambit fan. He's my favorite of the Marvel characters. My absolute favorite of all Marvel characters is Gambit. Come on, guys. So anyway, yes, I did read some comics, but I was never as into comics as a lot of people my age were. And you could chalk that up to being sheltered or just not having access to it, whatever. I didn't frequent comic shops. That just wasn't part of my experience, except when it was. I do remember reading, speaking of Star Wars, I remember reading the Dark Empire graphic novels, which are now lost in the Legends category now, but they've used some subtle things out of that and incorporated into the new Star Wars stuff. But other than that and some X-Men comics and stuff, I really didn't read a lot of comics. I think comics are extremely valuable and they're a big part of a lot of people's journey, so I love it. Sherlock Holmes was another big one for me. I remember being in middle school, or you might think of it as junior high. The way my junior high was set up is we had what we called core, which was reading, writing, and science, and then we had other classrooms that we went to for other subjects like music or art or home economics and things like that. But in core, we did our reading and we did our writing and math and things like that. So I remember in seventh grade, I read through the entire catalog of Sherlock Holmes written by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. I was just absolutely enamored with it. It's to this day one of my favorite sets of crime fiction, detective novels, mystery novels. It was very formative for who I am as a reader and as a story consumer. Some of my favorite things to watch are adaptations of Sherlock Holmes. I used to watch the old Basil Rathbone classics with my dad, which aren't really based on any of the core Sherlock Holmes stories, but they're fun. They really do embody well who the character is. And I really enjoyed watching those. And of course, you've got Jeremy Brett in the Granada television production of Sherlock Holmes, and Benedict Cumberbatch as the more modern Sherlock Holmes. And I've watched so many adaptations of Sherlock Holmes, and I absolutely just eat it up because he is one of my favorite literary characters. And the movies with Robert Downey Jr. and Jude Law, just fantastic. I just absolutely love that IP in all its iterations. Some are better than others. I've read some that aren't so good, but I've read some of the newer authors that are writing new Sherlock Holmes stuff, and I love their stuff. So Sherlock Holmes was a big influence for me in terms of love for mystery fiction. And Agatha Christie is another one. You'll remember I said my parents weren't big readers themselves and didn't really heavily promote reading in our household, but my grandma was a big reader and she had a bunch of books in her library. She had a bunch of Agatha Christie novels. She had all the Mary Stuart King Arthur novels, and I just absolutely ate those up too. I'm a huge fan of Mary Stuart. Anything Arthurian, I at least want to give it a try, right? And a lot of that comes from all the books that I would borrow from my grandmother. And I read a bunch of the Agatha Christie books as a kid. Most of them I don't remember now, and so I'm in process of rereading them. But they meant a lot to me, and that was a big part of my story. And my grandmother absolutely loved how much I wanted to read those stories because they were a big part of her life as well. She was a huge fan of Agatha Christie, and so she was just a big reader in general. And her bookcase showed that. She had a bunch of classic novels, just a really big reader, and story was very important to her. So I absolutely love that I had that influence from her and the influence from those books that she shared with me, that she was willing to share with me from her library. She had one of those old turnstiles that you see in used bookstores, and she I don't know where she got it. She probably got it from a bookstore maybe, or but yeah, she had all of her Agatha Christie books on a turnstile, and I would go over to her house and, what are you going to borrow this time, Charles? And yeah, it was amazing. And I briefly mentioned King Arthur, one of my favorite movies from the 80s, and I've probably seen it at least a dozen times or more. and that is Excalibur. It's one of my favorite portrayals of the Arthur legend. I've seen some other good ones since then, but it is one of the movies that was really formative for me in my enjoyment of that particular part of English lore. I just absolutely ate it up. I didn't actually see Excalibur until I was probably older than when the movie actually came out. And so I had already read the Mary Stuart novels by then, and I just, anything Arthur that I could get my hands on, I was just absolutely loving it. And that movie was really formative for me. Another thing that you might be surprised by is Dune. So I never read the books until I was an adult. I watched the movie from the first time it came out. I didn't see it in the theater, I don't think. I remember getting it on video cassette, though, and watched it over and over and over. And yes, it was definitely David Lynchified. It was not the core story from the book. I came to find that out later when I actually read the book, and I'm like, oh yeah, this is totally different. I still love the book. It's my absolute favorite sci-fi of all time. But the original Dune movie has an extremely special place in my heart. It's one of my absolute favorite science fiction movies to this day. I like the new Dune movie. I think it's awesome. It's way more accurate to the book, but the original movie will always have a special place in my heart. It's a core part of my journey as a story consumer. Now you might be asking yourselves, well, Chaz, what about Lord of the Rings? Yeah, I didn't read Lord of the Rings as a kid or in high school or anything. I read Lord of the Rings for the first time in my late 20s, or maybe it was early 30s. And so I never experienced it before that. I never read The Hobbit in school. So those are extremely important works for me, especially because that was the first fantasy book that I read as an adult when I came back to reading. So it's an extremely important part of my journey, but it didn't form who I am as a person who enjoys stories. It formed me as an adult fantasy reader, but it was not part of my journey from the time I was very young. And I don't know why. I don't even remember ever being introduced to Lord of the Rings until I was in college, and a friend of mine said, oh, hey, you should read Lord of the Rings sometime. This stuff is just awesome. And then the movies came out, and I saw the first movie before I ever read the book. And I didn't read The Hobbit until after I'd read Lord of the Rings. So I kind of did everything backwards. It's still a very formative piece of my adult reading journey, but I haven't had Lord of the Rings as part of my life for as long as I can remember. It's just been in recent years. And the same is true of the Chronicles of Narnia. I never read those as a kid. I read them for the first time when I was reading them to my kids. And so that was a lot of fun, and it was a great experience. It's a wonderful story, but it just was not part of my childhood. One series that was part of my childhood for a brief moment, and that was when I was in 7th grade, in junior high, I picked up the Sword of Shannara for the first time. And of course I didn't know that it was a knockoff, so to speak, of Lord of the Rings, because I never read Lord of the Rings, but I just picked up this book and I'm like, oh, this stuff is awesome, and so I was really eating it up. But even with Shannara, I didn't pick it up again until I was an adult. I read that first book, and I just never read any more books by Terry Brooks until I became an adult. And then I started picking up Shannara again, and since then my kids have read some of the Shannara books, and it's just been an awesome experience, but it just wasn't part of my journey. So it's interesting to see how I have become the lover of fantasy that I've become, more based on movies than books necessarily. It kind of seems backwards, but It's just who I am, and I am very, very thankful for my journey. I look back and I wouldn't change anything about it. I mean, maybe I would have liked to have read more books as a kid, but I didn't, and that's okay. I still consumed a lot of wonderful stories. And so I think I'm going to end it there. I rambled on a lot on this topic. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope you've gotten some good value out of it. I would love to know what some of the stories are that shaped your existence. I would really love to know that. And feel free to share with me down in the comments. Hit me up on Discord. We can talk about it there. I would love to have a conversation with you about the stories that shaped you. And with that being said, guys, I hope you have a wonderful day. Make sure that you read more books and just consume more stories in general. I'll talk with you soon.